Okay, so the last thing we were talking about was this descent of the Ganges, this large piece here, and we looked at several details from it. We are well into this period now of the Bhakti movement, where Hinduism is focusing on this idea of devotion to a particular god. And by this time, Hinduism had really sort of resolved into sort of four basic groups, four basic movements, and these begin dominating really by the, a little by 1000 or a little after, and right up to today. These are very clear divisions in Hinduism. It sort of settled into this. The largest group is the Vaishnavism. It's called Vaishnavism, and that's just related to Vishnu. It just means followers of Vishnu, and also his many avatars. And particularly today, Krishna is a very important figure for this group, and we're going to look at Krishna and talk about why Krishna is so important. Rama also is important, but these are all just avatars of Vishnu. So Vaishnavism, the largest group of Hindu practitioners today, and second to that is Shaivism, and that's just the followers of Shiva. Now, each of these groups is really redefining the various gods and their roles for their own sect. So to the Vaishnavists, everything centers around Vishnu. Vishnu's now the creator god. I mean, it's really a redefining of everything. And the same for Shaivism. It's Shiva is the center of everything, and everything is because of Shiva. Shaktism, remember, Shakti is that female principle. So that's a smaller movement, but that focuses on the female principle, or the so-called divine mother. And of course, there are many different female deities that could refer to, but Parvati, I should say, plays an important role. She is Shiva's consort. And then there's another group called Smarta, and I don't really know much about that. All I know is that they really treat all the gods as basically equal. There's no one more important than any other. And I know that typically their temple shrines will have individual shrines to many different gods in them. It's probably the closer connection to earlier practices where more gods played important roles. So we'll see temples we'll look at a Shaivist temple, and we'll talk more about Vaishnavism and the role of Krishna in just a moment. In this medieval period, it was remember, after the Gupta fell apart, we get just a whole series of different smaller dynasties in different parts of India. It's not like one big rule everywhere at this time. And in the south, we get the Chola. The Chola dynasty was one of the most powerful. They took over and controlled the south probably around, they controlled all of the south by 900, but they also spread Hinduism. As we're going to see when we look at Southeast Asia, there is still some Hindu presence, but it was even bigger, and that was because of the Chola dynasty. They sent out religious figures and gurus and others, and there was at one time a lot of Hinduism in Southeast Asia. It's sort of pulled back right now, and you just see the remnants of it in a few places, particularly in Cambodia. We'll see the remnants of where at one time Hinduism played an important role. But under the Chola, we get one of the most recognizable images in all Hindu art, and that is the very famous Shiva Nataraja, or Lord of the Dance, or King of Dance is sort of what it means. And I think I mentioned before how important dance is in Hindu ritual. A lot of Hindu ceremonies and rituals do include dance. So dance is a religious metaphor as well, and particularly for the maintenance of the cosmos, as we'll see. I'm showing you four of them here so you can see what they all have in common. There are certain things that all Shiva Natarajas have in common. They vary in small ways, but what they all have in common is basically the positioning of Shiva. He is dancing. usually within a large orb or circular form that symbolizes the cosmos itself, that will be in flame, all those little flames around the edge. We'll talk about the symbolism in a moment. He has 4 arms, and this identifies a particular avatar. People ask, why do some of them have 10 arms and 12 arms, and there are, 100-arm versions of this figure and 2 arms? Well, the number of arms identifies a different avatar. Each one of those is actually a different figure that symbolizes something different. So by adding more arms or various things like that, you can actually just create variations in that figure and what it symbolizes. So Shiva Nataraja, or Shiva Lord of the Dance, has 4 arms. It also gives him more hands so we can have more mudras. And remember, mudras are symbolic hand gestures. So, if I've got 4 hands, then I can give you 4 different mudras, meaning different things, as opposed to just the 2 hands. And these are always the same in each figure. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer. The 2 arms out front are the same. One arm is sort of pointing down. This is called the elephant trunk gesture, and it's more of a dance position than it is a spiritual mudra. But at the same time, it does have a specific meaning. He's sort of pointing to that leg, his raised leg. And in doing so, he's saying, kind of look what I'm doing here, and you can do this too. And I'll explain in a minute what he's actually doing there. The other hand, front hand, he has a fear not mudra, Bhaya mudra. You can see it right here. One hand out, meaning don't be afraid. And we saw that in Buddhism, but it's also in Hinduism. They're exchanging people, they're exchanging stories, they're exchanging mudras all over the place. The 2 back arms, which are out, now these signify creation and destruction. Remember when we talked about sort of the 3 deities, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer, how they symbolized this cyclical creating, sustaining, destroying, creating, this sense of the circular sense of life. Well, under this period, and particularly to practitioners of Shiva, or belonging to this group, the Shaivists, they give Shiva all of those. So we already saw that once in the Shiva Mahadeva sculpture where he had 3 heads, right? One of them was creation, one of them was preservation, and one was destruction. We see that here as well. In one hand, Shiva is holding a flame, and that symbolizes destruction. So he can destroy the world. And the other hand, it's kind of always hard to see. You can actually see it better up here again. He's holding a little hand drum. It's a little drum that you drum like this with your fingers. And that's like the sound of a heartbeat, and that symbolizes creation. So we've got destruction and creation in his 2 hands, and then the dance is preserving. So as he dances, he sustains and preserves the cosmos. So he's doing all 3 of those things here. In all of them, he's also standing on this little figure that's usually referred to as the demon of ignorance, which again is a symbolic form symbolizing ignorance, or the opposite of enlightenment, basically. So he's stamping out ignorance while he's creating, sustaining, and destroying the entire cosmos. And in the middle of that is Shiva. You can see some of them, he has like this hair flailing out in all directions, creates a wonderful sense of movement. And in one of them down here, there's like a scarf that's flying out in the air. Another one, he doesn't have that. So that's not required. That actually identifies him as an ascetic, because the ascetics had this long hair because they just lived out in caves and didn't cut their hair. So sometimes he's presented as an ascetic, and he's generally wearing a crown. Now, you may very well be familiar with this one in the Nelson Gallery. It's really a beautiful piece. It's on a high pedestal right in the middle of the room. I wish they put it on a lower pedestal. That really bothers me that they have it up so high. In this one, clearly that orb around him is missing, but it was there. You can actually see in the base where it had been attached. So at one time, this did have that big orb around it. But other than that, it's all there. And on that little demon figure, I have to tell you, on an exam once, I had somebody who told me this was a woman dancing on a baby. And that's problematic in so many ways. You know, I mean, pretty much every word in there is wrong. But it does show you that, you know, if someone doesn't know anything about it, they may very well think this is a woman, because it does have sort of soft qualities. But that, again, is just, you know, a Western eye looking at something that's sort of the extreme opposite of our sense of gender stereotypes. So, but it is Shiva. And whenever Shiva is identified as Shiva, Shiva is male. A beautiful bronze piece. Yes, please.
Who is commissioning this art for the artisans to create? And
it's a good question. Certainly the ruling dynasty would be paying for anything that would be in a temple. They support the temple. They support the anything relating to that. They could certainly be privately commissioned by any wealthy people, anyone who has money who would want one of these. So you might find it in a palace or someone's private home if they're very wealthy, and then you would find them in temples and on shrines. So these are the sort of things, there's so many of these and they were so common. These would most likely have been mass produced, very likely made in large numbers and sold, just because it is such an iconic image. It would be like, you know, beautiful, tall gold crucifixes. They don't wait for a church today to commission it. They're going to make a bunch of those because there's always people out there that are going to want those. But, you know, these are for the wealthy, like everything else, then, now, and always, probably. So, yeah, but that's a good question. But these are one of the most common images. So these are most likely the ones made in larger numbers. And they come from they're associated primarily with the Chola dynasty. That's when it was most prominent. Now we're up to 1000. And I want to look at another site. This is like now in what's considered the north. You know, we looked at a site earlier where we saw the southern temple style, which was, you know, carved back into the rock surface, and it had a lot of different structures that were separated from one another. But the northern temple style develops in the Deccan and north. And I want to look at a site called at Khajuraho. And Khajuraho is actually a site where we have a great many temples. It's very common in India for precincts to develop, where here's an area where there are dozens of temples, sometimes Jain temples or Buddhist temples or Hindu temples, but it's like a holy precinct. And that's not a unique idea. That was typical in the ancient world as well. You would have an area of a town that would be considered the holy precinct. We just don't do that today. I mean, if you could imagine there being a large area in Kansas City where all the churches are located just within this one region, and think of it as the holy precinct. I mean, it's an idea that's, you know, totally foreign to the West to a great extent, but it does have a long history. So this is one of many temples. It's dedicated to Shiva, so this relates to Shaivism again. It's the Kandarya Mahadeva temple. It literally means great great god of the cave is how it's translated. Mahadeva, Deva is God, Maha is great. So Mahadeva is great God. We've already encountered that once before. And Kanduriya simply means sort of the cave, or related to the cave. And that cave metaphor, sometimes it wasn't a metaphor. Sometimes it was an actual cave. That's where they started. We saw that in the Shiva cave and Elephanta. Now it's just a metaphor, because this is an actual building. It's the first actual building, and yet it's made out of sandstone block in such a way to resemble the bedrock itself. It's meant to look like it's carved out of the bedrock when it's really actually constructed out of sandstone block. It uses no mortar at all, and very few metallic sort of rods. In a few places there are sort of metal rod inserts that help hold the blocks, but mostly it's just the weight of the blocks that hold them together. It's this beautiful sort of buff colored sandstone, and we've encountered that before in this region in sculpture. We saw some beautiful Gupta sculptures that were made out of this same color sandstone. In the northern style, all of the features are in one structure. It's compact. It's also more vertical, has a very strong vertical orientation. Here's a plan of the building. Now, it's meant to mimic a cave inside. And if you look, the interior walls mimic exactly the exterior walls. So if there's a zigzag on the exterior wall, there will be the same on the interior wall, because cave walls aren't flat and straight and smooth, right? They move and they undulate and they move around. So it's very cave-like. We have a reduced mandapa. Remember, the mandapa in the earlier ones was a much larger hall, had a lot more columns, but it was the same function. It was just a large open hallway for ceremonial practice. Perhaps the dances are here during certain rituals. This is still the kind of temple where you're not going to congregate. It's where maybe one or two people might go in quietly in order to sort of circumambulate. It also has the Lingam shrine, now really thick walls around it, very, very cave-like. We'll look inside in a moment. And it has, well, the Garbhagriha is the womb chamber, is what that literally means, and the shrine is inside. And then we have a circumambulatory path so that you can circumambulate. Smaller areas, that's where you see here. This is the only light that gets in, is from these open sort of balcony areas, which you see right here. There's no other windows or ways for the light to get in. The towers that we see, well, yeah, let's back this up. You can see the towers better. The towers that you see, there are many of them, and they're very elegant. Now, this is clearly meant to look like a geological formation. You know, it's like a mountain, a holy mountain. You've got these horizontals that really look like the layers or striations of the earth. You've got these towers that look like peaks. There's almost like rivulets, valleys that run between them. You know, very much the metaphors of the earth itself, with the peaks and the clefts in the rock faces. When we look, here's a look at the Lingam Shrine. There's not much to see. It's a simple form inside, but it's hard to find images of this because I don't think you're supposed to be taking photographs of this, but I did happen to find one. And you can see there is some sculpture around the figure itself, but most of what you see, and here's another view, an interesting view, where you can see the entrance, how it's up on a very tall platform, very tall pedestal, and a very dark entranceway here back to the Shikara, or the tower, that is now directly over the Lingam Shrine, which is where it was supposed to be. It wasn't in earlier temples, but this is sort of a fully developed. To me, this is the culmination of starting with a real cave, and then a rock cut temple into the cliffside, and now a freestanding temple, but it's made to look like it's still a mountain and a cave that you're going into. So it still has that. Now, the sculpture that you see all over the building is ornate, and it's everywhere, and it creates this wonderful patterning all over. The theme of this temple, in fact, this whole temple is dedicated to the wedding of Shiva and Parvati. So they are, to Shaivism, to those followers of Shiva, they are like the primordial couple. They are the essential couple that symbolizes the male and female energies, and their union then would be sort of the symbol of completeness. Certainly Shiva and Parvati symbolize that, but there are two figures we're going to see in a little bit that symbolize that even more. So there's a lot of images of couples embracing, sexual unions. You know, you still see things like this Trebanga pose. You know, one of the first images we saw in Buddhism was that Yakshi figure, and she was standing in that three body bend pose, really a dance pose. You still see the figures in that pose. And this is actually a scene from a temple not far from it. It's not the same temple. This is from, well, this is the Kandarya Mahadeva. I was thinking it was from a different temple. But again, you see, you get a sense of scale here, and also the sort of decorative surfaces and elements that you can see on temples. This is the one that's from the Parsvanatha temple. Parsvanatha temples dedicated to Vishnu, and you see Vishnu and Lakshmi here on this, but it's in the same region. It's just down a little ways from the Kandarya Mahadeva. And again, the two couples, typical Indian style. We still get, she is very, very much like that very early Yakshi figure, the exaggerated female forms, that exaggerated curves of the body, the sensuality of the figures themselves, all still there, sort of the culmination of this Indian style. And this also was whitewashed. All these temples were once whitewashed, just like the one at Ellora, Kailash Nath temple at Ellora, again, symbolizing the Himalaya mountains. Now I want to talk a bit about the role of Islam in India, and how that enters and when, and how it affects the art and the context of art. And it's a long and complicated story. Muslim presence was in the region as early as 712. As early as 712, there were Muslim traders, generally in the area of Sindh, which is this region down here at the base of the Indus River. Clearly they came by ship, and this was where Muslim presence was centered. And then you very soon began to have Muslim merchants and traders who were moving through the country. So Muslim presence was there fairly early. No one paid much attention to it. It was carried east by raiders. There were some who were raiders and bandits as well as merchants, but it was slowly carried east. By 1000, this is when we get an influx that's going to have more direct impact. And that doesn't come from the sea, it comes from the land, through the passes here, through the Khyber Pass from the Afghanistan region. And we get Afghans, Turks, and Persians. And this time they're coming in to stay. When we think of the Muslim area or center in India, it's in the north, and it's going to be Delhi. Delhi is the Muslim center of India, and that will become the capital for a number of reasons. And there are two groups I want to talk about. Just briefly, the Delhi Sultanate and then the Mughal Empire. And I'm really going to only look at the art from the Mughal Empire because that's considered one of the great golden ages in Indian history, and certainly of Muslim Indian history. So the Delhi Sultanate is founded in the 13th century, and they are a large sultanate, capital in Delhi, and there, as you see here, it says the Rajput kingdoms. The Rajput, and we'll be talking more about the Rajput are Hindus, but they are Hindu princes who formed alliances with the Muslim leaders in exchange for their own land, ruling their own land. The Rajput were very wealthy Indian lords who ruled their own land. It's an interesting relationship that was formed. It at first reminded me a bit of the Mallas, which we talked about Wednesday in Kendall's class, but I think the relationship is a little different than that because these were not, they were not sort of dependent on them. Well, they kind of were dependent on them. Wait a minute, I can't do anything till I get rid of get my arrow back. Let's see who's here. Kendall's not here. Kendall, oh yes, you are. Yeah, I was going to ask about this. Kendall, are you here?
I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, I just had myself muted.
Oh, I was going to ask about this because this relationship between the Rajputs, it reminded me of what we were talking about Wednesday with sort of non-Islamic people and this sort of relationship that they formed. But I think this is a little different because these were princes who had their own territories, but they formed this relationship with the Islamic rulers to rule their own lands in exchange for sort of being left alone. So yeah, it's not the same, right? Because
well, I would be shocked to learn that no money changed hands. You know, I mean, I'm sure that that there was a system by which the Islamic forces or whatever, call it taxes or call it tribute or whatever you want, as long as they're getting paid off, they're sort of like the Romans, you know, you do what you want as long as we're getting our cut.
Well, the same thing happened with the British, and it's the same people. The Rajput also, I mean, they call it the Raj in India. It's this period where these Hindu Rajas or kings formed these relationships. So the Delhi Sultanate was a fairly positive period. They were quite moderate and tolerant of other religions. And while that lasted, it was a very good time. In India, as you can see, their control is relative. You know, it's you see, you know, a map is one thing, reality is another. And they really had very little control in these areas. Ostensibly, these people were part of their sultanate and probably paid them some taxes, but there was nobody really down here ruling anything. They were very much on their own. Now, what happens next and where the Delhi Sultanate disappears to, we have to see in the context of something that's beginning in China. And that is the rise of the Mongol Empire. And that's going to have a direct effect.
Can I just point out one other thing? I think that the imported Islamic administration, if you will, was never successful in doing anything about caste. And there was a real cultural conflict between Islam, which has this sort of ideal of equality, and the caste system. And so that was one of the reasons why Islam didn't stick in a way in India, because those two things were so sort of mutually opposed.
Well, that makes sense. It's also why Buddhism didn't stick in India. Yeah, because the caste system becomes so deeply rooted that even now, I mean, technically there's no caste system in India, but, you know, everybody knows there is. Yeah, that's a good point. Hadn't really thought about the caste system. Okay, let's talk briefly about the Mongol Empire and how it affects India, and then we'll encounter it again when we get to China, of course. It begins with Genghis Khan in the north, and when he dies in 1227, the empire is divided among his two sons and other important leaders. One son, Ogadai, his oldest son, gets control of the larger region here, which is known as the Great Khanate, and he was known as the Great Khan. This will very soon, hasn't happened on this map yet, but very soon they will absorb China, and we'll talk about that when we get to China. His second son, Chagatai, gets a Khanate here. There's also the Il Khan and the Golden Horde. Now, one of the things about the Mongol Empire is they were like sponges. They tended to absorb whatever the religion was in the area that they conquered. Also, one reason why they don't really last very long is because they weren't really interested in conquering and controlling a region. This wasn't imperialism. They weren't out there because we want to take your land and we want to run this land. They were purely interested in conquest. And once they defeated an area, they didn't really want to stay around and rule it. I mean, they weren't administrators. They just wanted to find another area to go conquer. They just wanted to fight. You know, they didn't want to do the administrating of that area. And that tended to be always their downfall. They would leave people behind, but then those people failed pretty quickly and everything just went back to being the way it was before the Mongols showed up. And that's a pattern that happened for quite a while. So we've got all these Khanates here that are briefly in power, but it's actually an empire. The more important is an empire that many people don't know much about. I mean, everybody's heard of the Mongol Empire, but not many people have heard of the Timurid Empire, and it's far more important historically. By about 1400, the Khanates are collapsing. I mean, and they're collapsing just because nobody's paying any attention. They're not administering anything. It's a couple generations later now, and basically the local people are just sort of taking back over the land. The Mongols had been stayed behind, were being assimilated into the culture that had been there before. But what we have is a new Mongol leader arising, and his home was Samarkand. And for a while, Samarkand was a very, very important city in Asia. It's on the Silk Road. Samarkand is really a beautiful city. It's in Uzbekistan today, and the people were Uzbeks basically. But Timur, the man I'm talking about, was actually part Mongol and part Turk. So he built a sort of Mongolian Turkish empire centered first at Samarkand. We know him in the West as Tamerlane, and that name was just in the back of my mind. Like, I can remember somewhere in a history class studying someone named Tamerlane. I don't think I knew much more about it, but Timur was his real name. And he built an empire that really rivaled that of Genghis Khan. He went out and conquered the remnants of the other Khanates as they still stood. And this map, I have to point out, this map is wrong, very, very wrong, because it shows the Ottoman Empire all the way up here. And 1405, the Ottoman Empire was not way up here. They haven't even conquered Constantinople yet. So the Ottoman Empire is just a little thing over here. You know, it's just the burgeoning empire at this point. So anyway, it was not that at the moment. But then he set out for India and decided he wanted into India. And he did this because the Delhi Sultanate was actually quite wealthy. They were doing very well, and he needed a pretext. First of all, he was a Muslim by this time because they were absorbing the religions, and he felt that he was more hardline. He felt the Delhi Sultanate was being far too lenient because they were not repressing Hinduism or any of these other religions. Now, whether he really felt that or that was just his excuse to invade the Delhi Sultanate, you know, who knows? But he used that as his reason to invade another Muslim nation. Well, that didn't bother him. He invaded the Khanates, and they were Muslim by that time anyway. So he invades India and conquers India, and this was devastating. The destruction was really unbelievable in this battle. It's called the the Battle of Delhi, or the Battle for Delhi, and it was terribly vicious. The Delhi sultanates, actually, they had about 150 war elephants, as they were called, and they attacked Timur with all the war elephants. He took hundreds of camels. I hate to even say this because I find it really disturbing, but he took hundreds of camels, and they filled them all up with like brush and wood and set them on fire, and stampeded them into the elephants. And the elephants were running, and if you can imagine 150 and hundreds of camels, I mean, they were just stampeding everyone everywhere. And that was just one battle. It was really brutal. And he finally won that victory. And then in less than a year, he turned around and left. He had, okay, I've destroyed it. I'm going to go find something else to destroy now. I'm bored. But he left behind descendants. He did leave people behind, and they set up what was a very repressive regime for quite a few years, for about 100, 150 years. It was a very repressive regime. He appointed a governor there. They founded the Sayyid dynasty in India, which is a very long-lived dynasty, actually, to rule there until the Mughals take over. Very cruel. It was a very hard time in India, a time of real repression. However, all of that begins to change with his descendants, and it begins to change by the 16th century. And it begins with Babur, who is a descendant direct descendant of Timur. But he's also, and you never know, but you never know how much is true, when you're reading history and people are claiming descents. But he also claimed direct descent from Genghis Khan through his mother. So, and I read that history books, everything I read says he's descendant from Timur through his father and descended from Genghis Khan through his mother. Nobody says supposedly, so maybe there is some evidence for that. I don't know. Anyway, Babur is the first to really make a change, and it's usually considered a Turco-Mongolian dynasty. Both through Timur, and he's the first of five. Now, the dynasty, the Mughal Empire, does not end with Shah Jahan, but these are the five great leaders. These are the five important Khans, and they are each father and son. Humayun is Babur's son, Akbar is his son, Jahangir and Shah Jahan. So this is father to son for 5 generations. And I have to say, this is interesting because, and I've mentioned this before in other classes, this form of empire in which you have a patriarchal system where it passes from father to son to son to son, that system appears in a lot of places around the world. Certainly it was in Rome, at least for a while. And there's a kind of unwritten rule that I've found. I wrote the rule myself because I've observed that system can never last more than 5 rulers. That's a max. You don't always get 5. Sometimes it's only 2 or 3, but I've never seen anywhere in the world where it's lasted more than 5 before the next generation is incompetent, or incapable of ruling, or just stupid, or whatever. So this follows the pattern, and they're lucky to make it 5, but it's Shah Jahan's son that messes the whole thing up and ends really the glory of the Mughal Empire.
The other thing is that someone turns out to be infertile.
Well, that's another thing. There isn't a son, right? Yeah, but these guys had a lot of wives, I think.
Yeah.
So they were pretty good at getting sons. But yes, that's the other one, that you just don't get a son, or if you do, he follows in line, but he ends the golden age. He ends the great reign, which we have here. Now, Babur's son Humayun was when he was in office, and I don't remember why, but he was briefly in 1540, he was briefly forced out of office, and he went to, it was Afghan rebels. I don't know what they were rebelling against, but he fled to Persia. And he was in Persia for 15 years. And during that time, he did two important things. He married a Persian woman and he had a son. Akbar was born in Persia. And when he returned 15 years later with his Persian wife and his 13-year-old son, he also returned with a whole entourage of Persian artists and painters, which became the basis for the Mughal school of Indian painting. And from here on, Persian art is as big as influence in India as anything else. He retook Delhi and then died a year later. But nonetheless, he brought with him a whole new style. His son, Akbar, is usually known as Akbar the Great. He is the third Mughal ruler and usually considered the greatest. That's why he's called Akbar the Great. The Akbari style is important. As I said, he was born in Persia. He was a very popular ruler by everybody. He was humane as an individual. He practiced, interestingly, a kind of hybrid form of Islam that actually incorporated practices from a number of different religions in his own practice. And in his palace grounds, he had a small Hindu temple, etc., for people in the court that were Hindu. So it's a kind of, liberal interpretation of Islam that is somewhat unique at the time. And that's certainly why he was so loved. And he had this tomb built for his father. So it's Humayun's tomb, but it was built by Akbar in the Akbari style. It's a stunning building, and it's a beautiful merging of styles. It's the first to use the Persian dome in India. It's the first sort of dome, and that dome is a very typical Persian style. I'll show you a Persian dome in just a moment. The first use of arches like this, the pointed arch in Islamic arch, it's a fusion of Persian and Indian design. These towers are they're sometimes called like little pavilions. They're an Indian style. So there's Indian style, even stonework itself. Working with stone is what Indians have been doing. It's not necessarily an Islamic architectural style, but it's working with tile work and other forms that are purely Islamic. So it really is a beautiful merging. Islamic architecture like this is very metaphorical. I mean, they're very beautiful because they represent paradise, particularly tombs, and they're going to have beautiful gardens that accompany them, always with water. That's a very important symbol of paradise. So a lovely structure. Here's a corner view, and here's that dome, that OG dome. Did I have the word back here? Yeah, here I wrote OG dome, and I didn't tell you what it was. OGEE. Here you can see OG domes. OG domes sort of, number one, they have two qualities. They bulge out a little bit at the base, rather than, it's not like your basic sort of Roman hemispherical dome. It bulges a little bit right at the base, right here. And also they come to a point, which is a little different. And what that shape does, there are two things happening here that make these domes feel very light, very lightweight, as opposed to being massive structures. One is the bulging right here, which psychologically makes you think of it as something like swelling out, almost more like a balloon or something that's bulging. And then the sort of point at the top makes it feel like it's floating and moving upward. The second thing, in addition to its shape, is its surface. Now, this dome here in the lower right is from Isfahan, and it's a beautiful example of an Islamic dome. It's on a mosque, and it's covered with arabesque design, this wonderful curvilinear form, and it's tile work. But Islamic domes are covered with tile, which is highly reflective, and it makes them look lightweight. It also, because of the patterning, draws your attention to the surface. And I've said this before, in the previous class when we looked at Byzantine art, and here's another way that this is similar to Byzantine architecture. In Byzantine buildings, there would be a lot of design and decoration to draw your attention to the surface. The more you can make the viewer think about the surface, the less they will think about the mass. So it doesn't feel massive for that reason. And when you combine it all, you get what sometimes called an eggshell dome, because it really feels that delicate, that light and thin. And there's no reason to think this is actually any thinner or lighter than any other sort of big concrete dome. It's just that it's psychologically, it's a visual weightlessness that we see here. And this is a very good example of it in the Akbar style. Now, Akbar absolutely loved art, and all the Mughal leaders did. He set up workshops teaching with Persian teachers, teaching the Persian style based on Persian miniatures, and we're going to look at some of that in a minute. Now, you may or may not know, but in Islam, there is a ban on images of people and animals. You're not supposed to depict them in art. It's iconoclasm. It's a version of iconoclasm, but it's also true that stricture is followed very differently in different parts of the Islamic world. And in Persia in particular, that ban was interpreted very differently. They're not going to make religious images. They're not going to depict Muhammad or anything like that. But in terms of other sorts of images, particularly images that depict adventure stories, adventures, they love those. And there's a long tradition of what we call Persian miniatures. And the word miniature, it really isn't a reference to the size of it so much as the fact that it's from a manuscript. Any images, and this is true in Western manuscripts as well, any images in manuscripts are called miniatures because they are relatively small compared to other forms of art making. We know that Akbar had himself over 24,000 manuscripts commissioned, full manuscripts with illustrations during his reign. And the most famous of all, and we have to look at a scene from the Hamzanama, because the Hamzanama is one of the most famous stories in the Islamic world. It means literally Adventures of Hamza, and Hamza was Muhammad's uncle. And it tells all of the stories of his adventures, and there are a great many of them. The story was very popular. It spread throughout the Islamic world. And as it spread, the stories grew because there are other people named Hamza in the Islamic world who were adventurers, and all their stories get merged together. And so while it's officially the stories of Muhammad's uncle Hamza, it's really the stories of lots of people named Hamza and all of their adventures. Now, Akbar had a version of this commissioned. It's one of the most famous versions. It is actually considered the supreme achievement of Mughal art. I mean, the whole Hamzanama is phenomenal. Originally there were 12 volumes and over 1,400 illustrations. There are only 200 illustrations remain today, which is still quite a lot. They were not bound in books. They were loose leafed, or what we call album leaves, and they were kept in boxes in order, and they functioned. You can see this is pretty good size, 26 by 20 inches. They were aids in oral storytelling. You used them and you held them up and you told the stories. They're all action, they're all adventure, they're nothing about character development or anything. It took about 15 years to complete, and it is in what we call the Akbari style. It communicates through color, pattern, rich colors, patterning, gestures. The story's told in little vignettes, like there's a little thing going on over here and a little thing over here and another little story down here. The style is one of contours, sharp contours. This one, Asad ibn Kariba launches a night attack on the camp of Malik Iraj. I don't know a lot about Arabic, but I do know that Ibn means son of. That I've now exhausted my knowledge of Arabic. So it's Assad, son of Hariba, etc. So now you can say you've been studying Arabic too. Now, the way this would work is there is writing on the back telling a story, but the writing on the back of this image is not this story. Two people were involved in the process. One person would be holding this image up, possibly walking around, while another person read the back of the next scene. So then he'd put this one down and pick this one up. So there are two guys, guy holding it's not the guy reading it. So there is a sequence to the scenes. They have to be kept in sequence because the story is on the subsequent image. It's a really interesting concept that I've never encountered anywhere else. Now, the one thing that we notice right away is how different the concept of space is in this scene. This is very different from a Western conception where we're used to, a Renaissance conception of a painting as being a window that you're looking through into a believable space. And then we have that Western sort of obsession with accurate scientific space and placement of figures in space. We simply don't have that. In the West, we read space in three things. We read distance three different ways in the real world or in a painting or anything else, by overlap. If something overlaps something else, it's closer to you. By scale, something far away is going to be smaller than something close. And by location, something higher up is farther away from you. I mean, just look out your window and you will see all of those things. And it's how your mind reads spatial location. So we have all these things happening here. It's just that we don't have the calculated perspective to tell us exactly. It's more intuitive. We know this is farther away because it's higher. We know these figures are smaller than this figure, so he's farther away. And there's overlap here, so this guy is closer than anything else because he overlaps everything. So he's the closest. So we can still read it without the Western conception of space. But it is hard for us to read because of the pattern on pattern on pattern, which makes it really difficult. But when you're used to it, it doesn't matter. It's all about energy. What I love about this is, Western art is usually so careful to give you a certain kind of balance, a place for your eye to rest so that you can read the scene. This is just the opposite. Your eye doesn't rest anywhere here. You're drawn in probably by this guy because he's closest, and then your eyes up here, and then it's over there, and then it's down there, and there are lines and things that draw you all around it. I mean, that's the point. This is a wild adventure. It's not a calm place where you rest. It's meant to be chaotic, and color plays that very important role. Jahangir is Akbar's son. Now, Jahangir has a particular unique role the others didn't have to deal with, because he is on the throne when the British arrived. Well, first, the Portuguese have been there for a while. The Portuguese arrived in 1498 and settled in Calcutta, but the Portuguese are the first ones everywhere. I mean, look at the whole world. The Portuguese are the first ones in Africa. They're the first ones in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Portuguese were out before everybody else by a couple hundred years. But the reason their impact wasn't as profound is because they weren't colonizing at that time. They were traders. They were going and setting up trade and going home. They weren't out there. They weren't conquering or colonizing, at least Peggy, not at that time. Yeah.
But before we get too far into the next centuries, can we go back, because I just want to tell you about the paintings I'm familiar with that look exactly like that.
Yeah.
Are court records from the Ottoman Empire, from Suleiman the Magnificent.
Yeah.
In the 1500s, and the reason I know is because there are several of them that record his encounters with King John Sigismund, the Unitarian king of
Ah,
Transylvania. We have a painting of I mean, it doesn't look exactly like this because it's not a battle, it's a court scene, but
mhm.
it has that same something going on at the top and something going on in the middle and some, but there are identifiable figures, which include Queen Isabella presenting the infant John Sigismund to the Sultan. And
Wow.
then later, like 20 years later, he comes himself to sort of ratify his protectorate treaty with the Sultan. And this is what those paintings look like. And I never knew the part about stuff on the back, but I bet there's stuff on the back written that are part of the court records as well. But partly what they did to record things was to make these kinds of paintings about events that happened at the court. And that's part of how we know some of the story about the first Unitarian king.
Wonderful. I'm sure it's direct Persian influence. Those
Yeah.
Persian miniatures are going everywhere in the Islamic world, and that influence is being felt throughout. So I'm sure it's the same source.
They weren't in a book, they weren't bound. So the
Right.
thing about keeping them in box, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because you might have a box for a year or for whatever units they used that would have been the paintings for that year. And it was
Oh,
somebody's job in the court to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
Cool.
that style is everywhere, and that's quite a ways away from India. So yeah, excellent. Thank you. And interesting, your mention of the Queen presenting him. This is, see this guy right down there? That's James the First.
He's European, isn't he?
Yeah, that's King James the First. When the British arrived, Elizabeth I established the East India Company Charter in 1600, and then she died 3 years later. So by the time the British actually arrived, James I was the king. And when the British arrived, and the British center of India is East India, it's Calcutta, that's really the British center. And when they arrived, they brought all sorts of things with them, including a lot of art and a lot of paintings. And of course, Jesuits and a lot of other people. Well, no, the British didn't bring Jesuits, but they arrived on their own separately. But nonetheless, they were clearly looking at British art by this time. And this is interesting. We actually know the artist's name, and he may actually be in the picture. Some people think this guy down here is Victor, but we just know that this was the name of the guy who painted it. By the way, all these paintings are watercolor on paper. They're an opaque watercolor medium. This is Jahangir himself depicted sitting on a throne. This has several names or titles. It's sometimes called Jahangir preferring a Sufi sheikh to kings, which is a kind of political interpretation, but I've also heard it titled Jahangir seated on an allegorical throne, which is another interesting way. He's seated here cross-legged, interestingly, with a sun and a moon disk behind him in a very sort of Buddha-like fashion. And this figure is identified as a Sufi sheikh. Sufism was very influential in the court at this particular time. And he's handing him a book, and I don't know what that book is or the significance of it. We see a Turkish sultan here who was captured, implying or identifying that a number of Turks had been captured by Jahangir's men. Down here we have James I, so I could see how you could interpret this as, well, he's preferring the Sufi sheikh, he's giving him the gift, and James is down here. There are a lot of weird anachronisms in this piece, like the two little strange putti figures, and puttis are these little figures that appear in Western art and religious art from the Renaissance on, that are like little Cupid / cherubim figures that aren't really either, but are sort of both, and nobody knows exactly the origin of it. It's a complex origin. And then we have more little figures down here. So is it a classical reference? Is it a Christian reference? I mean, nobody knows. They're just little figures that they had seen in paintings and put inside. The other thing I would point out is, the manuscripts we saw had abstract designs all around the outside. But now we're getting floral design, clearly Western inspired floral designs. These are not Asian depictions in any way of floral designs, but this artist had clearly seen Western floral paintings like this. The other thing we see is portraits. One of the things that the Europeans brought and that the Mughals started sort of demanding was portraiture, accurate portraiture, which didn't seem to matter much before the British arrived at all. And then this is a portrait of James, which is undoubtedly they had portraits of the king they brought with them, which were used for this portrait detail. And there's text here, and the text says, "O Shah, may the span of your life be 1,000 years." Yeah, so very strange, start getting these bizarre sort of anachronistic things during this period. Why don't we take a little short break right now, and then we'll take a look at some architecture from the Mughal Empire. So let's take 5, everybody, and get up and walk around, and then we will be back.
Two things, Peggy. Is that an hourglass that he's seated on? That's so interesting. And the other thing is that in those court records, they're always wearing European hats. And that's how you can tell the Europeans from the Muslims or the Arabic people, because they always have turbans or like crowns or whatever, like the king is wearing. But all the Europeans have those Elizabethan hats. It's really a funny way to pick them out.
Well, it's common to do that. We'll see that in Japanese art. There'll be a lot of Western and in Indian art. I mean, not in Indian, in African art. After the Portuguese arrived, you start seeing figures. The Portuguese apparently wore those like pith helmets, those dome shaped. You start seeing them on figures in African art, and they identify the Portuguese. So yeah, hats are a pretty distinctive way. I can even remember when we were looking at Persian art, the palace of Darius and Xerxes in Persepolis, where we had all those ambassadors walking along the walls and up the steps, and they identified all of the different areas they controlled by their headgear, because they all wore different headpieces. So yeah, we don't wear things like that now. So in the future, nobody's going to know who we are. This does have an hourglass here, and I don't know what that's about or why these guys, I'm sure that means something, why these guys are scooping up the sand or something. I don't quite know what that's about. Okay, anyway, let's move on and talk about Agra, which is just west of Delhi. And of course, we know what's in Agra: the Taj Mahal. Jahangir's son, Shah Jahan, is associated, of course, with this building, and it is. I would love to see it. Any of you seen the Taj Mahal? I would love to someday, because just from the photographs, and if someone were to tell me this is the most beautiful building on the planet, I don't think I would argue with them, because I can't think of anything else that is comparable. The name literally means the crown of the palace, and it's like one of the last great Mughal structures. Afterwards, after this period, there's real decline in the Mughal Empire, and certainly that sort of liberal flowering of the arts in general and literature, and the decline of patronage and painting. Everything declines after this moment. It was, as most people know, a memorial to his wife, a memorial and the tomb of his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, which means light of the palace. She had 14 children. And she deserved it. She deserved every bit of this building. Design, of course, has its roots in Humayun's tomb. I mean, you could see it, the minute you saw that building, I'm sure you thought of the Taj Mahal, but the beautiful white marble just takes it to another place. It does have a mosque in it as well, which is why we have the minarets here that we didn't on the other one. This is really the culmination of like 300 years of Indo-Islamic tradition in building. Mosques and tombs all comes together here. We get, again, the introduction of those materials, the stone carving tradition. The grounds are equally beautiful in the gardens. You have things like fruit trees that symbolize life and cypress trees that symbolize death, the beautiful fountain up the middle. The main building, as you see here, is pure white marble inlaid with precious stones and other kinds of marbles. It has the central dome, OG dome, and the pavilions, again, the smaller domes, 4 of those, very, very delicately done, that sort of unify the building. It's just, as a structure, it's a sort of perfect balance, you know, the size and shape of the dome to the structure itself. It's just harmonious. It unifies and has this wonderful rhythms everywhere. Almost translucent marble. This white marble in places is very light, delicate, and really belies the scale and mass of the building. Again, the focus to the surfaces so that we don't see mass. The central arch has inlaid black marble as well. So a lot of those designs are black marble and semi-precious stones so that it glitters. You can see some of the marble carving. And that is the interior. Again, this deep undercut carving that takes away all of the weight. The color itself is, wait a second, let me slide this over. The color itself changes. And I've read this, I'd love to see it. It's not something I think you can capture well in photographs, but the color apparently changes depending on the weather and the conditions and the time of the day. It's pink in the morning. It's meant to be pink at sunrise. It's milky white in the evening, and under moonlight, it can appear to be sort of golden, and that's intentional. They say that reflects the many moods of a woman depicted in all the beautiful colors. So, you know, that's okay. I'll take that. Now, unfortunately, Shah Jahan's son seized the throne from his father and took a hard line. Actually, this sort of liberal flowering under the Mughals was actually the whole time was somewhat controversial within the Muslim world. It wasn't like, you know, this is okay. They always faced sort of hardliners who were arguing against this. And Shah Jahan's son is one of those and took the throne from his father. And he imprisoned his father in the Red Fort, as it's called, which is not that far from the Taj Mahal. But he did make sure that his father's cell, where he spent the rest of his life, was in the corner here so that out his window he could see the Taj Mahal. Now, I don't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, whether he was like tormenting him with it or whether he was being kind, letting his father see that. But anyway, that's how he spent the rest of his life. And he immediately ended the liberal flowering of religions. He withdrew, not only that, he withdrew patronage for the arts in general. Everything changed from that moment on, and it became more repressive as a regime and less successful as a regime as well. Now, during this time, there is still Hindu art being made, and I want to take a look at a couple of things we just referred to as Rajput art, or the art of the Rajput. Rajput referring to Hindu art under the rule of Islam, and there's going to be clear connections. Rajput art is very influenced by the painting style, the Persian painting style, or the Mughal painting style now. And we see that, you know, they're developing their own literary tradition. This is really interesting. These are things that I didn't know anything at all about at the time before I started studying these areas. And one of those things I learned about was ragas, ragamalas. And like everybody, you know, I'm familiar with raga, I know, I've heard of Ravi Shankar, I know what raga music is, but I didn't know it actually meant anything or that there was anything particularly significant about it. And it is, it's really part of a much larger, complex artistic form that involves poetry and painting. And these are all symbolic, unlike the Mughal painting that we saw, where it's really about the images, the stories, it's narrative. These are not narratives at all. These are totally symbolic, and they're about creating particular moods. One of the things they were really fascinated with was sort of love stories. This is a period where within Hinduism, there's a great emphasis on the great lovers. And I'm thinking Krishna and Radha, which I'll show you in a minute. But these are other great love stories. And they take on, a spiritual significance. But it's about creating a kind of musical mode, a type of music, as well as an emotional mood created through the colors, the shapes. The colors are all symbolic of various things, as are the shapes, as are the images. Clearly they're still fairly busy, but they're less cluttered. They're structured. As you can see, there's an architectural structure here that lends details. And I don't know all of the symbolism. I do know this one on the right, Madhavi Ragini. The raga is when the story is the lover is a man who's coming to see his love. And if it's a woman coming to see her love, it's called a ragini. So these are both raginis. The Malasri ragini is the woman's name is Malasri. And in this case, the other one, her name is Madhavi Ragini. So it's her story. And she's coming to visit her lover. And just as she's coming in, the monsoons begin. And these are the rains up here that are just beginning to fall. And she hears the scream of a peacock. If you've ever heard a peacock scream, they're terrifying. It sounds like somebody's being murdered. It's this loud, horrible screech. You can hear, I swear, for miles. So she's like startled just as the lightning strikes and the peacock screams. And that's what's happening here, as she is sort of stopped and turned, and he sees her coming in the door. So it's a powerful emotional moment, and that's communicated less through the narrative than the colors and the details. So, but they're accompanying music. These also speak of music. They also speak of poetry. So they really can't be separated in sort of the raga, ragamala. Ragamala literally means garland. Mala means a garland or a ring of something. So it's a garland of ragas. But my favorite is the stories of Krishna and Radha. And this is also Rajput art. This is a slightly different style, but it's not so different that I feel like talking about it. It's from a slightly different region, Pahari, instead of Rajasthan. But this is really the height of the sort of cult that centers around Krishna. Krishna is the 8th avatar of Vishnu. So this was part of the Vaishnavist practice. And at this point, Krishna really overtakes Vishnu in people's minds. He is more important even than his original source. Krishna is described as the creator god. He does everything that any of the other gods have ever been given credit for. They're all Krishna now. And the story of Krishna and Radha in Indian culture is like Romeo and Juliet in the West. I mean, it's at least that well known. And it's a more powerful story in some ways. I find it one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard. Krishna was the human manifestation of Vishnu. He could take human form, and he came down in his human form, and he was also the most beautiful man you had ever seen. I mean, all of the women fell in love with Krishna because of his beautiful, it's called monsoon blue. And he's always that color. Sometimes Vishnu is painted blue as well, but that's because Krishna is. And he was flirting with the women. And he met Radha, who was a cowherd, one of the women that went out and took care of the cows in the fields during the day. And they immediately fell in love. It was not just an ordinary love or lust. This was two soulmates meeting. The problem was she was already married and he was a king who had obligations. He ended up having, you know, like the story is like 1,000 wives, but remember, he's not real anyway, so it's okay. We can say anything we want about him. And he had obligations. And the fact is, the two of them never got together. They never met again. It's one of those, I mean, Romeo and Juliet might be tragic in the end, but at least they got to be lovers or be together for a little bit. Krishna and Radha were sort of doomed, and they were literally seen as two people with one soul. And for the rest of their lives, all they thought about was each other. In fact, you're never supposed to say the name Krishna without the name Radha, to the point where a new figure developed known as Radha Krishna. And Radha Krishna is one name, one word. And it's this union of Krishna and Radha in the heavens, because after eventually they did get to be to heaven. She was so pure of heart that she became a god herself. And because of that, they could be together in heaven, even though not ever in the real world. And it's just this deeply moving story about love in a way that's different from most places. It's like, you just see somebody and that's it forever. And it's a very, very powerful story within one context, the sort of Vaishnavite context, but even in general, you're never supposed to say one name without the other. And he never married her or even came to see her again, because he had duty, he had obligation. He was king, and he had to do his duty. And then she was true to her husband. She couldn't, you know, be unfaithful to him. So that's why it's popular as well. You know, it wouldn't have been as popular if they'd snuck off and met each other in the story. I mean, it wouldn't have been the same thing. So Krishna and Radha, and by 1600, that is one of the most important stories. Okay, let's see what happens when the British arrive. I love this painting. It's just stunning. It's again, watercolor and gold on paper, but is there any question the British are here now? Because this is one of our Rajas. This is one of our Maharajas, one of our great kings during the British Raj, Maharaja Jaswant Singh II of Marwar. It's filled with these sort of cultural fusion of the period. His existence itself, you can see how rich he is, how he's been given, he's wearing British insignias that identify how important he is. This gold insignia, it's very British, and you've got 1880, that would have been Victoria down here on his sort of cameo. And he's also wearing this gorgeous emerald necklace, which identifies his sort of Indian power. So he's got British power and Indian power, and that's what the Rajput signify. So all of these details signified British, which signified power, and feed into this beautiful little painting because it's small. But, you know, I love the sort of girth, this sense of, you know, he's got a presence, you know, he's a real physical presence here, and that's meant to be, you know, these Rajput warriors, because that's how they thought of themselves. The Rajputs were warriors. They go on to be really the the Indian army, and even today, when you look at the uniforms and the details, these are soldiers that are from the upper caste. These are people who identify with these great kings of the past. So it's very different from sort of armies in other parts of the world where soldiers are conscripted and forced, and sometimes it's the poor and unemployed who are forced to go into the army because they can't find another job. In India, you have to be born to the caste to be in the military, and that goes back to these Rajput warriors who signify something very specific. And I don't want to spend much time on the British, but I just didn't want to show you, I did want to show you this building, the Victoria Terminus in Mumbai. And it's another one of those sort of merging of styles, this sort of grandeur of architecture. That's one of the things the British left behind, was architecture in this British style. But you still have the Indian pavilions and little pavilion domes and things like that. I find it interesting, even on the top of these domes, which are influenced by Islam, it's the pointed dome, you have these little forms that are very reminiscent of those parasol forms, the chatras that you saw on the top of the Buddhist stupa. So it's like merging of all the different forms. Okay, there's one site I want to look at before we move to Tibet. One site I want to look at just outside of Kabul in Afghanistan, reminding you of the Silk Roads. We're going to be looking, when we get into China in particular, we're going to be looking at a number of sites that are at crossroads, at places where these various trading routes crossed. And these become very, very important sites. Wait a second, I'm looking for something here I can't find. Here we are. They're very important cultural sites where cultures overlap, where ideas are traded, where you learn about different religions. And Kabul was one of those sites along the road. And what I want to do is look at Bamiyan and talk about what is no longer there. This is the only work of art I think we're going to talk about that doesn't actually exist, but did once. It's the very, very famous colossal Buddha. There are two of them actually at Bamiyan. You can see there are a number of small caves along here. It's part of a tradition we're familiar with, and one giant figure. A lot of people traveled through these crossroads, and a lot of people from all across Asia saw these figures. You can see there's a gigantic standing Buddha there. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like today. I'm sure many of you remember when this was destroyed. There was so much publicity about it. It was a World Heritage Site, and the whole world was begging the Taliban, please don't destroy these. And of course they did. The two giant ones, they blew them up. And there are a number of reasons for that. Not all of them were necessarily religious. It had to do with the vast amount of money that people were spending to preserve these. At the same time, many people were starving. And I totally understand that frustration, because sometimes it bothers me too, when you can spend $1 million for a painting, you know, when there are people starving, you know, it's a painting, for God's sake, feed people. But nonetheless, it was destroyed, but we still have plenty of photographs. It is believed to be the large one, and this is the large one here, the one that's 175 foot tall, is believed to represent Virachana, which is one of the 5 transcendent, and we're going to start seeing more of those, not Shakyamuni Buddha, not the real man, but one of the transcendent Buddhas. He symbolizes enlightenment. The purpose, they think, was to express the greatness of Mahayana. Mahayana was just spreading during this period, and this is one of the crossroads where people were traveling and learning about those ideas. There was a Chinese traveler actually who went through here in the 7th century and wrote about these figures. And at that time, he was intensely impressed by them, but he also described them as having metal. In fact, one of them, the smaller one, he described as being bronze, a bronze figure, but it wasn't bronze, and also described them as having jewels. So we do know they were painted. They were brightly painted, and they may have had, some scholars think that the faces may have had thin bronze sheeting on them, so they looked more like gold or something. But, you know, we just don't know all of that right now. This is the smaller one, which also no longer exists. It was only 120. You know, how did they do this? Well, they're actually stairways inside. You can see these external things. They first, before you do anything, you got to figure out how to get to the top. I mean, this wasn't done by putting up, you know, tall ladders. They actually carved out inside here staircases. that you go up to get to the top. And once you're up there, then you carve out, a place for you to stand, and then you can start carving back in. Apparently, and I don't understand how this worked, but apparently originally there was a way to circumambulate up here somewhere near the head. It's carved out in back. It's not attached to the back in a couple of places. And one place is somewhere around the head. So you could actually, there must have been like a platform or something. Maybe you walked on his shoulders or something. I don't know. But you could walk up the steps and circumambulate. And then also the feet were carved behind, so you could circumambulate at the feet, which probably most people would do that rather than walking all the way up. The style is certainly influenced by the Gandhara Buddha style from the Northwest. You can see the drapery more. It's more of a region where you would expect a classical influence to a certain extent. And now that they're gone and they're total rubble, they did go out and see if maybe it could be put together, but it couldn't be put back together. But what we did have is in 2015, an artist, and I don't know who this artist was, I could find out, I just haven't, had this special projector made. This projector cost $120,000 to make this special projector that could project this image. And there were a couple of different Chinese documentaries that were made. I mean, he may have been a Chinese artist, I don't know. But for a while, there was this image that just sort of put it back in the niche, which is an interesting way to sort of think about or replace something that is lost.